In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? A tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone, raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government.
So if you don't know when the last time we tried to use tariffs to fix things in our country, it was the Great Depression. And you can go watch Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and you'll get a actual factual lecture on whether that worked or not. And the answer is it didn't work. It made the Great Depression worse. So we'll be back to that in a minute. But how do countries manipulate their trade? Well, we've talked about two things. We talked about exchange rates, and very little we've talked about tariffs, and we'll come back and talk to tariffs some more. But there's other things. So we have quotas. A quota is a limit. We just say, look, you can bring, we say to Argentina, you can bring, 10 million pounds of beef into the U.S. every year, and that's it. So we don't have a tariff on them. We don't have a tax on them. We just tell them, well, now we do. But we didn't. We just limited how much beef they could bring in the country. Number two, we subsidize things. We help Boeing. The U.S. government spends taxpayer dollars to help Boeing do exports.
I plan to take over the world.
We have licensing requirements. You can't just export software outside the United States. You have to have a license to do it. We have health and safety rules. We expect, quality. Again, we'll talk about all these. And we don't have, but other countries have ownership restrictions. So, for example, the U.S. has quotas with Canada. There was multiple times people in the U.S. government, the current U.S. administration, said, Canada has these huge tariffs on us. Well, that's not true. What Canada has is an agreement with us, which we signed and they signed. And it says if more than X number of pounds of dairy products come into the U.S. from Canada every year, a tariff goes on. We've never imported that much, so there's never been a tariff. Okay? Same thing with lumber. We have all the lumber that we buy comes into the U.S., or has been, not anymore, but has been coming into the U.S. without a tariff on it. If they exceeded a certain amount, then the tariff would pop onto it. Okay? That's a quota. So we believe in free trade. The system with Canada is set up to be free trade, but we want to protect our home market while still, believing in free trade. We stopped imports of beef from some countries because they had mad cow disease, right? Health and safety issue. We have requirements on Italian shoes for how thick the leather can be. So if you have a really cheap Italian shoe that the leather's really thin, we don't let you import that. It's got to be a certain thickness. Okay? Many countries, the United States to some extent, but Japan, for example, used to prevent imports into their country, not with tariffs. They said, we don't have any tariffs. But they had license requirements. And it might take years to get a license approved, right? And maybe by the time you get that license approved, you don't want to import that thing anymore. So countries can use severe restrictive licensing requirements to do that. And in Japan and in China, seriously in China, if you want to operate a business, you have to have a local partner. Now, Apple is the only company in China, U.S. company in China, that doesn't have to have a local partner. But that's because they train workers in other companies. Apple's trained 20 to 30 million engineers in China for all kinds of technology companies. Okay? China is building airplanes now. They build all kinds of high-tech stuff. They build all this stuff. Why? How? They stole the technology from us. We trained them. Apple trained them how to do stuff. U.S. companies came in there, trained them how to do stuff. Airbus came in there and started building planes and trained China how to build airplanes. So these ownership restrictions Japan too, these ownership restrictions help them build and target certain industries. You want to learn how to build airplanes, you get an Airbus wants to build a factory. You say to Airbus, yeah, you can build the factory, but you have to teach us, right? You have to transfer your technology to us so we understand how to build airplanes. Okay? It's, if we're, another way that we really should be having a fight with China is over this technology transfer, intellectual property, them stealing secrets from us. Their stealth fighter looks remarkably like our stealth fighter, and that's because allegedly they hacked the plans out of the Pentagon or the defense contractors. Okay? Russia's done the same thing for years. Russia, when the Europeans built the Concorde, Russians stole the plans and copied it with a few minor changes. Okay? We also subsidize. So there's a big controversy in Europe because they subsidize, instead of, in the U.S., if we're producing too much of a farm product, we basically pay the farmers not to grow. There used to be a whole bunch of dairy farms up in Mesquite, and now there's casinos sitting on top of those dairy farmers because we paid the dairy farmers not to be dairy farmers. Now there's casinos there. Europeans don't do that. They have the farmers keep growing stuff, but then they subsidize it when it leaves. So the price of wheat in Africa, European wheat in Africa, is below what it costs to grow the wheat in the first place. And they've wiped out, family farms all over Africa have just been wiped out by the Europeans dumping cheap wheat into Africa. Okay? And it's highly controversial, let's say, in Africa. Airbus, the governments of 7 European countries all are partners in Airbus. So we haven't traditionally done that. Again, the Trump administration is starting us on that path of kind of government socialism where we own companies or own pieces of companies. But the governments own Airbus. So the giant A380 airplane, Airbus didn't have to pay to design that, which is a very multi-billion-dollar expense. The governments, the taxpayers paid for Airbus to develop that airplane. Okay? We don't do that in the U.S., but we subsidize loans. So Boeing can sell a plane to an airline in Asia and give them an interest-free loan because the U.S. government is subsidizing, the taxpayers are subsidizing the loan. Okay? So the governments are actively involved in these things that are trade manipulation. All right. So tariff is a sales tax. It's nothing else. It's pure and simple a sales tax. Who pays the tariff? So China produces goods. Walmart wants them. They put them on a boat, send them over here to the U.S. They get taken off the boat in the U.S. and put on an area of the dock that's all fenced in and sealed off. For Walmart to pick that stuff up, Walmart has to come in to the government office, U.S. government office right there, and pay the tariff. Walmart pays the tariff. Okay? When they pick that stuff up at the dock. And then they drive it in to their stores. All right? So the tariff is paid by businesses and consumers in the U.S. All right? Everybody with me on this? So, who pays for stuff? Again, bottom row. Look at the bottom row of pictures there. Chinese worker builds something. It goes on to a truck here in the U.S. Whoever owns that truck or hired that truck paid the tariff. When it gets to the shelves in the store might cover some of the tariff, but you're going to cover some of the tariff. Tariff is going to be paid, could be paid all by the consumer, could be paid all by the American business that imported the product, or it could be paid by both, right? Oil, I put oil up there, oil, bananas, and coffee. Why we put tariffs on bananas and coffee, I don't know, because other than Hawaii, we don't grow that stuff in the U.S. But the deal here is that there are world prices set for that. There's a world price of oil, there's a world price of bananas, there's a world price of coffee beans. The coffee sellers are not going to lower their price, right? The Trump administration says, look, China might lower the price they sell stuff to Walmart to offset the tariff. It's possible. We ain't seen any of that. We've seen absolutely zero of that. But it's theoretically possible. Okay? But that's not going to happen with bananas. It's not going to happen with coffee. It's not going to happen with oil because there's a global price for those. And the price change there, the price of coffee has gone up 20% in the first 6 months that Trump's been president, raw coffee. At some point, Starbucks is going to look us all in the face and raise their prices. Right? For now, they stockpiled a bunch of coffee, right? They bought all the coffee they could before the tariff went into effect. But eventually, they're going to have to start paying these high tariffs, these 15, 20, 25% tariffs on all the coffee beans, right? The raw price of coffee beans in the U.S. has gone up 20% already. At some point, Starbucks is going to pass that on to us. Okay? All right, so we call this all protectionism. The arguments for protectionism are it can save jobs, it protects wages, it protects what we call infant industries, which are startups. So you want to protect a startup. It can be for national security. Okay? And again, we have examples, people have examples where all of these things have worked fairly effectively. And dumping again is when we sell something below the cost. So the Europeans are dumping wheat into Africa and selling it for a price less than it costs them to grow it. And the taxpayers of Europe are making up the difference. So we do these things, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But, economists think that the cost of them is higher than the benefit. All right, so here's a graph of tariffs. The tariff that they were talking about in Ferris Bueller is right there. But you can see that historical tariffs in the U.S. were pretty high. And then we get to the end of World War II here, and we drop tariffs a lot, and they go down, 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 down. So that before Trump became president, the average tariff in the United States was a couple of percent. Most things had no tariffs. Some things had reasonably high tariffs, but the average, 2%, 3% maybe on average. And the things we had high tariffs on are things we were protecting. So if you bought Canadian whiskey in the U.S., at least a third of the cost of that Canadian whiskey was tariff to protect U.S. whiskey producers. Right? Imported cigarettes and imported tobacco have huge tariffs on them. Okay? So we protect. Now, I have 3 dots over here. So you can see this is where, and even though it says 2000 here, the tariffs basically, if anything from here, had gone down. So I just like this graph. That's where our tariffs were, roughly, when Trump became president. Now, the red dot is general tariffs that every country faces. The black dot is the tariff on cars, and the green dot is the tariff on steel and aluminum, theoretically. Okay? Now, one interesting thing here is an imported car has a 25% tariff. Or an imported car part has a 25% tariff. And the administration says, look, we want them to be built in the United States. But then they put a 40% tariff on steel. So the price of steel, and they did this the last time they were president, and the price of steel went up. The last year Trump was president, the price of steel went up 30, 40%. You can use really expensive steel, or you can pay the tariff. The tariff is probably cheaper than the really expensive steel. So we're still trying to figure out the plan. And again, there's an assumption that a lot of this is negotiation tactic, and it'll make sense to us someday. But Wall Street, you notice that the Wall Street Journal started calling Trump Taco for Trump always chickens out, because he puts these tariffs on, and then 2 weeks later he takes them off, and then he puts them on, and then he takes them off. There's no tariff on small packages. So if you were a small American business and you bought in small quantity And, you got FedEx envelopes from China to take care of your customers. Those little envelope kind of things, they didn't have any tariffs on them. Okay? That's about to change, unless Trump decides not to do it, but he's decided that he's going to put the tariff on those small packages, which means he's going to tariff small businesses in the U.S. in a way that he hasn't tariffed them before. And again, going to be interesting to see what happens there. Okay? All economists believe that consumers pay a cost in a trade war, that some businesses benefit and some businesses are hurt by it. George W. Bush tried a trade war against Korean and Brazilian steel. The U.S. steel companies were all for it. Go, George Bush. The U.S. car makers begged him to stop because that was forcing them to raise the price of their cars. So it's very rare that you can make a trade deal in the U.S. that doesn't negatively affect people. When Trump was president the first time, we had a record number of family farm bankruptcies. We already broke that record this year, right? Because the way if we put tariffs on, if we do something, other countries do something back. So every time we put tariffs on Europe and China, they stop buying American farm products and they buy our farm products from somewhere else. Okay? You can't buy Kentucky whiskey anymore in Canada. They've just stopped. So the Kentucky whiskey producers can't sell whiskey into Canada. Okay? So 2018, 2019, consumers paid about $20 billion in tariffs based on the data. And we had these record numbers. That money that was paid in tariffs ended up getting paid to the farmers as a repayment for all of the business that they lost. So there wasn't any net gain to the Treasury. The money we brought in from tariffs offset the cost to everybody. Okay? Now, there was some advantage in that Mexico and China agreed to change intellectual property policies, but China doesn't really, and Russia, neither one of them, really follow deals that they make. China agreed to buy a whole bunch of stuff that they never bought. All right? So that's Donald Trump signing the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA. The U.S. actually has trade agreements with over 150 countries. The deals they're signing now are a page and a half long. Trade agreements are 200 pages long, 250 pages long, because there's all kinds of technical stuff that has to get written about how you're going to do things, and certain products are treated this way. So they haven't done any trade deals yet. They've done frameworks, right? And sometimes they claim that they had a framework worked out with China, and China said, no, you don't, right? They said England had agreed to do this. England said, yeah, no, we haven't. And so they have frameworks of trade deals with a bunch of countries. But those aren't real trade deals, right? They have a framework of a trade deal with Japan. And they said, well, Japan's going to invest all this money in the U.S. And Japan said, no, we didn't agree to that. So not sure exactly where we are on these things, but there's the only thing there are frameworks. There's no actual trade deals. And who has to approve a trade deal? Under the Constitution, that would be the U.S. Senate. So the U.S. Senate had to sign off on the USMCA. Whatever trade deals come out of this current administration, the Senate is going to have to approve them. So a little history here. President Clinton created NAFTA. It actually, again, started negotiations under first Bush. He created NAFTA. Second Bush tried to create something called the Free Trade Area of the Americas, where there'd be no tariffs anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. That didn't pass. Obama tried to create something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and that didn't pass. In fact, Trump ran strongly against the TPP when part of the point of the TPP was to isolate China, and he ran against it. And then when he wrote the USMCA, a whole bunch of the language in the USMCA is word for word cut and paste out of the TPP that he didn't like. So politics are politics. He created the USMCA, which is certainly better than NAFTA. But then he blew up the USMCA mostly, right? Part of the taco thing is he put all this stuff on, and then he just said, okay, I'm going to exempt these things that were under the USMCA. So we have tariffs with Canada and Mexico, but we have a ton of things that are exempt from those tariffs because of the USMCA. So Canada was in compliance with USMCA. Mexico was in compliance with USMCA. We're not. We negotiated it and we broke it. And President Trump said that the USMCA was terrible, and he said, I don't know who would sign these things. Literally, he said, I don't know who would sign these things. Yeah, we know who signs these things. Okay, people have short memories. So there are global trade institutions. So originally there was this thing called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, which was set up in 1947, and it was our buddy Keynes back in the earlier picture who was behind that. GATT morphed into this thing called the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which has rules for how you're supposed to conduct trade. The United States got China into the WTO, and that's when manufacturing employment in the U.S. collapsed and millions of jobs moved out of the U.S. into China. Okay, so we didn't do ourselves a favor there. We thought we were, but we didn't. Just saying. The WTO technically also has a trade court, so if you think you're being treated unfairly, you can take someone to WTO trade court. But again, who does it serve? Little countries think that the WTO favors big countries, which it does to a lot of ways. But then big countries own things, right? So you have banana plantations all over Central America and the Caribbean. Not one of those is locally owned. They're all owned either by a U.S. company or a French company. So when there's a fight over imports and exports of bananas, that's really the U.S. fighting France. And the countries where the bananas are actually grown and where the workers actually work are not even really considered in those trade disputes. Okay? And it's possible that right now the World Trade Organization is pretty darn irrelevant. Trump is rebuilding or trying to rebuild the world financial order. And nobody knows what the game plan is. Nobody knows what the end result that he really wants is. And nobody knows whether he can actually get there. So, yeah, we are where we are. Again, this is just a quick little map of the last time we put tariffs on, what happened to farmers. And you can see that all over the country, farm income fell by an average of 20%. Right? So all of these farmers who were selling stuff to China, were selling stuff to Europe, all of a sudden couldn't sell stuff to those places. And it was really good for the farmers in Brazil and South America because all of a sudden their markets bloomed and they could sell all kinds of stuff at good prices. Okay? Fun? Fun.